And there you go. And I just want to say a couple of introductory notes before Rabbi Diamond begins the session. First of all, in terms of question and answers, everybody is encouraged to participate. Zoom is always more challenging, so we have to try a little harder to make sure that this is a shiur, a real study session with one of the great scholars of not only the seminary, but of our door, of our generation, who we are honored to have with us today. So if you do have a question, just use the hand raise emoji so that Rabbi Diamond can call on you. And then that's how we're going to do it, if that works for you, Rabbi Diamond. So, okay. And then the sources for the session will be screen shared, and there will also be a link shortly in the chat. And finally, just so everyone knows, at the very end of the session, we will all be automatically moved back into the main meeting room for the closing panel. First, by way of introduction, Dr. Eliezer Diamond is the Rabbi Judah Nadich Associate Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Dr. Diamond has written on prayer, asceticism, and issues of environmental law and ethics. He is currently editing a commentary on Yerushalmi Psachim, written by the late Professor Louis Ginsberg, as well as a book on prayer. The prayer volume will address the problem of cognitive dissonance for the contemporary worshiper and will offer readings of traditional liturgy to help find meaning and relevance in these prayers for the modern Jew. Dr. Diamond teaches regularly to adult learners on behalf of JTS's Department of Community Engagement, and we are so pleased to have him teaching for us this evening. I now turn it over to you, Dr. Diamond.
Thank you so much. I do encourage, I'm sorry, of course, as luck would have it, I suddenly got a sore throat, but I will do my best. So I do encourage people to ask questions. I want to hear them. I also want to say that I hope you will understand that sometimes I might say that question is something for another time. And we have a very small group, so I don't think we're going to be overwhelmed with questions. I don't think that will be a problem. I'm going to do something unusual, at least unusual for me. I am very much tied to orality, but because of the nature of this topic, and because we're talking about words, I felt that I wanted to write out for myself what I wanted to say to you. I don't think it will sound like someone just reading off a page, but I am going to be doing that, and then I will stop. That will be interspersed with screen sharing. There are two files that we will screen share. And when we do that, and when I want to entertain questions, I will go back to the Zoom screen. Just a question, actually, before we start. How many people in this group you include the imahot in your tefillot? So I can't see everyone, but it looks like, please keep your hands up. I just want to see. Okay, a lot of people, in short. Okay, great, thank you. I will tell you that I won't call myself a recent convert anymore, but I grew up Orthodox. I was, and in some ways still am, a liturgical conservative. And it took me a long time to come to the conclusion that this was important, to include the imahot. And at this point, as I will outline for you, I think, just speaking for myself, rather than being an option, I think it is something that deserves a place in our tefillot. Now to my words. So the theme of this evening is expanding the canon. In speaking about the inclusion of a new formulation of the imahot in the Amidah, I'm speaking about expansion in two senses. The first is the literal one, in that one is adding to and modifying the traditional liturgy. But the emendation should not, in my opinion, simply be a transfer of the formula used for the avot to the imahot. In other words, as we say Elokei Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, then to say Elokei Sarah, Elokei Rivka, Elokei Rachel, Elokei Leah. Not saying it's a bad thing. At the same time, I'm going to argue for a different formula, and you'll see why. And part of the explanation is that I think we want a reclamation of the place of the imahot, and by extension, all women in our sacred history and in the history of prayer, referring to their specific experience. Now, before I proceed, I need to acknowledge that some substantive arguments have been made to support the view that there is no halachic justification to add the imahot, and that, in fact, according to this view, it is halachically forbidden to do so. I will also debatable, and some of them are based on inconsistencies. I did not want to include the relevant sources because I did not want the tail to wag the dog. Mainly, I wanted to focus on the larger ideological and theological questions and on the imahot that I've composed together with Rabbi Andelman and why I think it's important. If you are interested in this issue, there is a responsive by my friend and colleague, Rabbi David Galinkin. I sent the link, I think it was put in chat, I hope so, where you can find his responsive. Now, what I'm going to do now is I want to screen share is a brief summary of some of the points that he makes. So let's see now. Screen share. And here we go. Okay. Can everyone see? I know that it's the thing with the box. Okay, now we're good. So I've just summarized some of his arguments against adding the Mahou to the Amidah. First, Maimonides' view is that one may not add or detract from the first and three blessings at all. In other words, that there is less flexibility halachically adding to the first and last three brachot of the Amidah than there is to the rest of the prayers. I will just remind us all that in fact there have been additions. So for example, Zochreinu L'chaim, that is recited during the Aseret Yimei HaTshuvah, is something that is widely recited. So apparently there are exceptions to this rule. Second, with regard to other changes elsewhere in the liturgy, he disallows them, although he accepts that after the fact, one's prayer is valid. So now we're not talking about the first three and the last three brachot of the Amidah, but Tefillah in general says that after the fact, such additions are accepted, but they should not be added ab initio. And I will just add at this point, the big question is, what would the argument be for making this change? Three, furthermore, some understand Maimonides as specifically invalidating a prayer, even after the fact, in which the theme of a blessing has been changed, in which it is argued would be the case if the matriarchs were added. Of course, my argument is going to be that the whole point of adding the imahot is to say that they are integral part of the theme, which is the importance of our ancestors, the patriarchs and the matriarchs. Four, the blessing as presently constituted uses biblical language. In fact, Elokei Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, the very first phrase which appears after Baruch Atah Hashem, Elokeinu ve'Elokei Avotenu, God and God of our ancestors. So this is a biblical phrase that appears twice in Exodus, as are the two phrases that follow in the first bracha, Hakeel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vahanorah, God who is great, mighty, and awe-inspiring. The first was, and also Kel Elyon, God Most High, the first uttered by Moses in Deuteronomy, and the second part of a blessing was a blessing given to Abraham by Melchizedek in Genesis. So now the argument is, it would be inconsistent with the language of the Amidah, I guess stylistically, to create and insert a non-biblical phrase, right? The phrase Elokei Sarah, Elokei Rivka, Elokei Rachel, Elokei Leah appears nowhere in the Bible. So it's a sort of shotnays, if you know what I mean by that. We're mixing together biblical language with non-biblical language. 5, and this is a very important one. The verse that is cited, Elokei Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, and we'll see it in context, is a reference to God's covenant with the patriarchs. Nowhere in Tanakh is it mentioned that God formed a similar covenant with the matriarchs. We'll get to that. I don't want to react to that now. And finally, although Rabbi Golinkin acknowledges that there are sometimes changes in the traditional liturgy, in particular in conservative Sidurim, he says that permission to change the Sidur is limited to 2 criteria. One of 2 criteria. One is the prayer is patently false. And one of the examples is changing the language describing the sacrifices in the Musaf service from a hope for the restoration, Na'alev and Akriv, let us go up to Jerusalem and offer the sacrifices, to a description of the past. Asu v'hikrivu. This is what our ancestors did in the past. Now, why is this false, according to Golinkin? It's false because, or since, they did not wish to ask for something contrary to their worldview. Those who composed the conservative Sidur felt that the hope that the sacrifices be reinstituted was contrary to their worldview. Just want to point out at the moment that I don't see that that makes the prayer patently false. It makes it inconsistent with one's beliefs, which is not the same thing. His other criterion is that a prayer is offensive, such as the blessing, who has not made me a woman, Shelo Asani Isha, which you will not find in almost all, and certainly any recent conservative Sidur. Okay, so these are the arguments that Golinkin makes. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And now react to some of these, some of what Golinkin has said. And I want to focus on basically a central point, which is many of these arguments are self-justifying, if that's the right term. In other words, if we don't think that it is important for the imahot to be part of our tefillot, if we don't see them as being essential to our sacred history, as the avot are, then of course you're going to say it's another theme. There is no justification to add it. There's not enough reason to add it. And note, while Golinkin says we can change the tefillah talking about the korbanot because it doesn't reflect our worldview, well, what about those of us who say the exclusion of the mahot does not reflect our worldview? So you already, seems to me, have to have a certain point of view on whether it is important for the imahot to be present in the Amidah. And I will add, some people object to, they say, okay, we can bring in the imahot, but not at the very beginning of the Amidah. And my argument is that that is exactly the right place to do it. Because if we want to make the point that the imahot are as much part of our sacred history as the avot are, this is the best way to do it. Now, I want to go to the other screen share another, let me just go back. Screen share another set of sources. There we go. And I want to make the argument that while it could be said that the reason for the avot being included at the very beginning of the Amidah is that we want to mention the covenant, there are at least two other reasons that arguably are the basis for including the avot at the very beginning. And it seems to me that those reasons apply equally well to the imahot. So let's see that. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, first of all, let's just remind ourselves of how the bracha begins, or what the formula, the traditional formula is. Well, Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu ve'Elokei Avotenu. Blessed are you, God, our God, God of our fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. And note, by the way, and we'll come back to this, that this blessing, this opening formula, is different from all other brachot. All other brachot begin, Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu, Melech ha'olam. Blessed are you, God, our God, who is sovereign of the universe. And here, God is specifically tied to the avot. We will come back to that point. Okay, and then we have Moses' description of God, Hakeel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vanara. God is great and powerful and awesome. Most High, Almighty, El Elyon, which was included in Melchizedek's blessing for Abraham, who bestows beneficent kindness, who possesses everything. Now, who remembers rather, the piety of the patriarchs, and who brings, something's not good here. Okay. And who brings a redeemer to their children's children for the sake of his name with love. And then the conclusion. Now, notice this idea that including the avot at the beginning seems to mean, among other things, something that the rabbis call zechut avot. We invoke the patriarchs because we say, God, you know of their piety, and based on that, bring a redeemer to their children's children. Have compassion for us because we are the descendants of these great men.
Rabbi Diamond, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm not sure how you wanted to do this, but there is a hand up if you wanted to call on someone or you wanted to wait till later.
Okay, we can do that. Let me just, you know what? Just to be more efficient, could I just hear the question, although I'd rather see the person?
Marjorie?
Marjorie?
All right, Marjorie was having some audio problems, so let me go ahead and read her question.
She's on.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. In the imachot section that's been put into conservative prayer books, why is Rachel listed before Leah? Leah was the first wife, and she produced more children. So what is the logic?
A question that many have asked, to which there are answers, but to me, not a totally convincing answer. And I will admit that I am guilty of following that order in my version of the imahot. One argument is that Rachel, was the wife who Jacob really loved. Some argue that it just sounds better. I'm just going to say, your question is better than any answer that I could give you. And I'm going to leave it there. So now, and thank you for that question. And now let's come to the avot formula. Okay, so if you look here, you see, my screen is not working the way it should. So you see that there are two verses in which this phrase, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov appears. And let's see, we'll read them in the English. God said further to Moses, thus shall you speak to the Israelites. The Tetragrammaton, the God of your father's house, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This shall be my name forever. This shall be my appellation for all eternity. So the spirit of this verse seems to be that God is sending Moses to the people because they are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And somehow that fact arouses God to intervene. And presumably what arouses God to intervene is the promises that God made to the avot. And then you have another verse where God and Moses are sort of negotiating about whether Moses is going to go as God's messenger, God's agent, and God offers a number of signs that Moses can use, and he says that they may believe that Tetragrammaton, the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob did appear to you. And again, the sense of this seems to be that because we are their descendants, and perhaps because the promises that God made to them, we now are entitled to liberation. But now I want to make the argument that the inclusion of the avot, especially if we think back to the formula of the bracha, which is V'zocher chasdei avot, God remembers the piety of the patriarchs, and I'm going to add the word, and therefore, mevi goel livnei bneihem l'ma'an shemo b'yava. Because of this, God brings a redeemer to their descendants in love. This would seem to be what the rabbis describe as zechut avot, that in the merit of the patriarchs, God grants us liberation, or God has compassion for us. And this is indicated in Exodus 2, 23, 25. We're breaking into the Exodus story, and we're breaking in at the point that the first Pharaoh had died, and now there's a new Pharaoh. A long time after that, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites were groaning under the bondage and cried out, and their cry for help from the bondage rose up to God. God heard their moaning. God remembered the covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. So what we have here is God doing four things: heard their moaning, remembering the covenant, looking upon the Israelites, and taking notice of them. Now, not surprisingly, when we look at the rabbinic midrash, the midrash interprets each of these phrases and says that each of these phrases represents something different that God saw, or that led to God beginning the process of liberation. So first, we're quoting the verse once again. This is in the Jerusalem Talmud. A long time after that, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites were groaning under the bondage and cried out because of the adversity that befell them. Okay, nothing really new there. Now we have God's response. God heard their moaning because of their cries. because their cries, as the verse says elsewhere, rose up to God, and therefore God heard those cries. Now, and God remembered the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which means what, according to the Midrash? Mitoch zechut avot, because of the merit of the patriarchs. So here, the Midrash is saying that the significance of the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the fact that they were faithful to that covenant, faithful to God, and therefore their descendants merit God's compassion and God's saving power. Now, here's the point that I want to make. This expression, zechut avot, I'm going to skip over another case of that same phrase, appears also with regard to the imahot. So the rabbis know not only of zechut avot, but also of zechut imahot. To understand one of the references to zechut imahot, the merit of the matriarchs, let's first read a verse from Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 9. My beloved is like a gazelle or like a young stag. There he stands behind our wall, gazing through the window, peering through the lattice. And once again, the Midrash interprets each phrase of the verse. And remember that according to rabbinic tradition, although Song of Songs, a straightforward reading of Song of Songs, is that it's a love poem between a man and a woman, the rabbis interpret Song of Songs as being a love song between God and the people of Israel. And therefore, when we have this description of the beloved gazing through the window and peering through the lattice, what, according to the Midrash, is gazing through the window and peering through the lattice? Gazing through the window, this refers to the merit of the patriarchs. Peering through the lattice, this refers to the merit of the matriarchs. Zo zechut imahot. I could quote to you many other midrashim, and actually I'm going to quote to you one more, where the notion of zechut imahot appears. But before we look at the next one, well, let's look at the next one, and then I will sum up. So the next midrash is based on the verse that says that the Bnei Yisrael are to prepare themselves, they're to prepare the Passover sacrifice, and they're supposed to put blood on the doorposts. And now it is explained to them, God basically is explaining to them, and the blood on the houses where you are staying shall be a sign for you. When I see the blood, I will protect you. That's the translation I'm offering for the words Ufasachti aleichem. Of course, Pesach comes from that word. So that no plague will destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So God is coming with a plague, and by marking their homes, God knows not to strike those homes with the plague of the firstborn. We have to quote one other verse to understand the midrash that we will see in connection with this verse. And that is a verse in Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 8. Hark, my beloved, there he comes, leaping over the mountains, bounding over the hills. And you know already that this verse is going to be interpreted to be not about two lovers, but about God and Israel. So now let's see the midrash. The midrash goes as follows. It quotes the phrase from the verse that we saw in Exodus, where God promises, Ufasachti aleichem. I offered the translation, God will protect you, which to this day, modern biblical scholars debate how we should translate the word Ufasachti. Some of them agree that the probable translation is what I had above, and I will protect you. But Rabbi Josiah, one of the Talmudic rabbis, suggests a different translation, which indeed is favored by other biblical scholars. Do not read Ufasachti, I will protect you, but rather Ufasachti with an ayin, because chet and ayin in the Hebrew of that day sounded similar. So this is a word play. They're saying, read Ufasachti as though it's Ufasachti. Sorry, I'm not a Yemenite, so that was not perfect pronunciation, but you get the point. And if we take Ufasachti in the sense of Ufasati, it means I will step over you. This teaches us that the word of the Holy One, the Spirit of God, leaped over the houses of our ancestors in Egypt. And now that that verse has been interpreted in that way, it is linked to the verse that we saw in Song of Songs. And thus Scripture states, leaping over the mountains in the merit of the patriarchs who are compared to the mountains of old, based on a Midrashic interpretation of Deuteronomy. We won't get into that right now. So in other words, God is leaping over the mountains, means God is leaping over Israel when the plague of the firstborn comes, in the merit of the patriarchs who are compared to mountains. Bounding over hills, this means once again, God passes over the house of the Israelites. And why? In the merit of the matriarchs who are compared to the hills immemorial. And once again, it's based on a Midrashic interpretation of a voice in Deuteronomy. So here we have two Midrashim among many that speak not only of the merit of the patriarchs, but also the merit of the matriarchs. And so when we talk about expanding the canon, and specifically whether or not to add the imahot, part of whether one is going to say yay or nay is whether one is opening one's vision to the totality of rabbinic tradition. And instead of focusing only on the fact that the Torah talks about the covenant with the patriarchs, and that there are various references in our prayers to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and not to the imahot, perhaps it is time to say, let's broaden our vision just as the rabbis did in some passages. We have chosen to not to foreground those passages, but that's a choice. Now we can choose to foreground those passages and say, getting inspiration from this description that there is zchut imahot, just as there is zchut avot, there is a reason to find a place for the imahot in our liturgy, and in exactly the same place where we find a place for the avot. So now I'm going to stop share screening, right? And see if there are any questions. Okay, so let's move on. And let me see. Yeah.
Ron has a question.
Okay, Ron, did it.
Okay, yes, thank you. I agree with you, Rabbi Diamond, about the importance of the imahot.
Can't hear you.
Oh, hold on, maybe I'll make it a little louder.
Yeah, no, If you're right there, we hear you.
Okay. I'm thinking, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm thinking now of all the examples where the Imaot injected themselves into the Avot for the benefit of all of us. How Sarah injected.
Okay, I'm going to stop you because I don't want you to ruin my presentation.
Okay, sorry.
I agree with you 100%. And you are anticipating an important argument and really part of the basis for my Imahot, or our, I should say, mine and Rabbi Julia Andelman's formula. So I'm praising you, but for the purposes of my presentation, I'm going to ask that we hold off on that very important point.
Good enough. Thank you.
Okay. So let's go back to our sources. And now I'm going to make a second point, important point, which is besides the Avot being at the beginning of the Amidah, because God had a covenant with the Avot, and the argument is therefore the Imahot don't belong, although we'll come back to that exactly along the lines of the point that Ron made. There are other reasons. I just presented you with one. They are there because of the theme of Zechut Avot. And if that is so, then Imahot can justifiably be included as well because of the theme of Zechut Imahot. And now we're going to talk about a third reason that is given for the Avot to be included at the beginning of the Amidah. And I remind you that that the beginning blessing of the Amidah is very different. It's different from all other brachot. And if we look at this particular passage, it may give us insight into why that is. And this passage says, Babylonian Talmud Brachot 26b, it was stated, Rabbi Yosei, son of Rabbi Hanina, said, the prayers, that is the Amidot of Shacharit, Mincha, and Ma'ariv, were instituted by the patriarchs. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said the prayers were instituted to correspond to the daily offerings. This is a fascinating debate, and clearly it's not a historical debate. It is a conceptual debate. That is, should we see prayer as avodah, as a means of performing a liturgy on a regular basis that substitutes, that corresponds to the sacrifices, arguably for non-priests, this is their form of avodah, of service, and after the temple is destroyed, the tefillot are a stand-in for the sacrifices temporarily, or is the essence of tefillah the prayer of the heart? So in other words, in the explanation that it's avodah, it comes from God to us. God says, serve me. And one of the ways that we do that is through the Amidot. The explanation that the Avot instituted tefillah says, tefillah originates with us. We feel the need to pray to God, and that's where these prayers begin. Now, how do we know that the patriarchs instituted Shacharit, Mincha, and Ma'ariv? Let's just say that there's a long and winding road that the rabbis use midrashically to attribute each tefillah to one of the Avot, Shacharit to Abraham, Mincha to Yitzchak, and Ma'ariv to Yaakov. We're not going to let this detain us. Now we would be going down a rabbit hole. But here's my point. Arguably, the beginning of the Amidah begins Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, because we are about to begin the quintessential prayer. And the authors of that prayer are the Avot, at least according to one view. And therefore, in this bracha, it is appropriate to describe God as the God of the Avot rather than sovereign of the world. Can't prove that that's right, but I think it's a plausible theory. So hold that thought. And here's what I want to say in connection with what I just said. While it may be true, or I don't want to say it may be true, while the rabbis may claim or may see as a model for our prayers the Avot, let's not forget that they themselves saw a woman, Hannah, as a model for prayer. Remember the story of Hannah. She wanted a child, just a son specifically, and she goes into the sanctuary and she prays very, very quietly. And I'm going to jump down. We have the prayer, but I'm going to jump down to where is my, okay, here we go. Jump down to past the vow that she makes. She says, if you will look upon the suffering of your maidservant, I will dedicate my son to you. And here it says, as she kept on praying before the Lord, Eli, right, the high priest, watched her mouth. Now Hannah was praying in her heart. Only her lips moved, but her voice could not be heard. Therefore, Eli thought that she was drunk. Eli said to her, how long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? He reproves her. And Hannah replied, oh no, my Lord, I am a very unhappy woman. I've drunk no wine or other strong drink, but I have been pouring out my heart to the Lord. Do not take your maidservant for a worthless woman. I have only been speaking all this time out of my great anguish and distress. And to Eli's credit, he acknowledges that he has misunderstood completely the situation and says, then go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked him. Now, before we come to the rabbinic interpretation of these verses, think about what's going on here. Eli is the person who is responsible for the public sacrificial cult to make sure that all of the sacrifices are brought in precisely the right way. And any prayers or declarations or psalms or what have you that need to be recited or sung in connection with the sacrificial system are sung. This is a very public and impressive service. And Eli doesn't get, one could say, that there is another way of serving God with a small, still voice. And that's what Hannah is doing. Hannah is not offering sacrifices in pomp and circumstance. She says to God very quietly, this is my prayer. God, please answer it. And the rabbis understand this, and the way we can see this is that Rabbi Hamnuna said, how many significant halachot can be derived from these verses of the prayer of Hannah? The proper way to pray, the Amidah, or at least some of the proper practices, says Rav Hamnuna, can be learned from how Hannah prayed. As it says, and Hannah spoke in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice could not be heard. So Eli thought her to be drunk. The Gemara elaborates, from that which is stated here, and Hannah spoke in her heart, the halacha that one who prays must focus his heart on his prayer is derived. And from that, because it says she spoke in her heart, so that is interpreted as meaning we have to focus inward when we pray. And from that which the halacha is stated here, only her lips moved, the halacha that one who prays must enunciate the words with one's lips, not only contemplate them in one's heart, is derived. And now we'll look at one more. From that which is written here, and her voice could not be heard, the halacha that one is forbidden to raise one's voice. I'm turning it into a non-gender statement. In one's Amidah prayer, as it must be recited silently. So to me, there's an incredible irony here. The rabbis see the inspiration for the way in which we pray the Amidah as being the prayer of Hannah. And yet, there is no room for her in our prayer, as there is no room for the Mahou. I find this tremendously ironic and problematic. So the point that I am making here, I mean, to be a bit poetic about it, is that we may begin the Amidah with a vote because according to rabbinic tradition, they instituted the 3 daily prayers. But the rabbis also acknowledge that a woman had a role in determining how we pray. And perhaps what's most interesting is that one of the things that she teaches us is prayer doesn't have to be heard by anyone to be heard by God. And so to be a bit poetic here, I would say that maybe we have to look for the ways in which the Imahot also prayed, and perhaps we have trouble hearing their prayers and discovering their prayers in the biblical text, but I will argue that they are there if we listen and read carefully enough. I'll stop here and see, once again, if there are any questions that anyone has. Okay. So now I want to move on to.
Ron, did you have another question?
Oh, Ron, yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm very, this last few words really caught my interest here. What is the rabbinical formula then for either saying the first 3 brachot out loud and then silently, or the halakha for the repetition of the Amidah by the leader?
Okay, so that is a bit complex. Let's just start by saying that when we pray as individuals, not when the person, the Shliach Tzibur, is leading our prayers, then we are supposed to pray silently. So that is the model for how the Amidah is to be prayed. In general, the Shliach Tzibur says the prayer out loud, originally, apparently, for those people who are not expert in praying, and therefore they would listen to the Shliach Tzibur. The so-called Heicha Kedusha, where the first three blessings are recited out loud and the Kedusha is inserted, is a practice that originally was only to be used under certain circumstances, not as we usually use it, so that we can have a more streamlined prayer. But we do. To explain all of the details of where this practice came from, I'd have to be invited back for another class. Can't do it right now. But thank you for the question. Good one too, like your last one. So now we have a proposal for an Mahou formula to be recited as part of the Amidah, composed by me with help from Rabbi Julia Andelman, who you met earlier. And she was, a student of mine, rabbinical student, when we decided that this was important. So let me begin by introducing you to the formula. Me'adain Sarah, so this comes immediately after the Avot. Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. Me'adain Sarah, God who rejuvenates Sarah, Nidrash Lirivka, responds to Rivka's petition. Menachem Rachel, brings comfort to Rachel. Ve'ohev Leah, and expresses love for Leah. What I want to show you now is that two things really. One, that each of these phrases is based on biblical language and based on an event in sacred history. So whereas one could say, well, if you say Elokei Sarah, Elokei Rivka, Elokei Rachel, Elokei Leah, what does that have to do with the Imahot? You're borrowing language from a verse that has to do with the Avot. Here, the goal is to use first of all, biblical language, and biblical language that is connected specifically to each matriarch's experience in their relationship with God. And even if in each of these instances, we do not hear their prayer, as in the case of Hannah, we see God responding to them. And therefore, I would like to argue that God is hearing a silent prayer, that the Torah does not specify, at least in two cases, in two arguably it does, but those prayers are there and God responds. So let's start with the formula for Sarah. So remember, the three men, the three angels, visit Abraham, and they promise that in the same time next year, Sarah will have a son. As it says here, then one of the angels said, I will return to you next year, and your wife Sarah shall have a son. Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him. Now Sarah and Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. Sarah had stopped having the periods of women. And Sarah laughed to herself, saying, now that I am withered, am I to have enjoyment or rejuvenation return with my husband so old? So if we go with the meaning rejuvenation, then Sarah is saying, I'm too old to have a child. Of course, she's also saying that her husband is too old, which becomes a problem. But she is saying, I simply am too old. I have no hope that I can be rejuvenated such that I can have a child. And what happens? God is me'adain Sarah. Right? The word is in the text, acharei veloti haita li edna. Now that I'm withered, Am I to have Ednar rejuvenation? And so in our Imahot formula, we say that God is Me'adain, God rejuvenates Sarah. He responds to her despair. She laughs, but perhaps it's a sort of a bitter laugh. These people are promising me that I'm going to have a child, or the angels, or whoever they are. Come on, I'm too old. There's no hope for me. And God says that there is hope. And indeed, a year later, she has a child. Now let's look at the next example, the example of Rebecca. This is the story of Isaac, son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took to wife Rebecca, daughter of Tuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, sister of Laban, the Aramean. Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. And I'll just add here, it says that Yitzchak prayed Linochach Ishto, translated here on behalf of his wife. It can be translated as opposite his wife, and there actually is a midrashic tradition that they both prayed opposite each other. Okay, well, let's leave that aside. So he prays for her because she was barren, and the Lord responded to his plea, and his wife Rebecca conceived. However, there's a problem, verse 22. But the children struggled in her womb. And she said, if so, why do I exist? This is so painful that I don't know if I can bear this. So finally, she decides, let's see if I can make sense of this suffering. Why is this happening? And she went to inquire of the Lord. Lidrosh is the word. And the Lord answered her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 separate peoples shall issue from your body. 1 people shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So she went lidrosh to seek God, and in our formula, God was nidrash la. God made God's self available. That's how the word is used in Rabbinic Hebrew. God responded to her seeking, to her petition. So once again, here more directly than in the case of Sarah, we have God responding to the plea of a matriarch. And while we're here, I want to make a point. If you read in the original Hebrew, God's answer, Shnei goyim bibitnech, Shnei leumim mimeach yiparedu, there are 2 nations, 2 separate people shall issue. The Hebrew is, Ul'om mil'om ye'ematz, 1 nation shall be mightier than the other. V'rav ya'avod sa'ir. The translation here says, and the older shall serve the younger, meaning Esau shall serve Jacob. But it occurs to me, and I've shared this thought with some biblical scholars, some of whom have thought it's nonsense, and some of whom have thought maybe I have something here, that perhaps we should understand this as an oracle. Remember, the Delphic oracles would give some prediction. The only problem is that it could be understood in more than one way. So whatever actually happened, the oracle could say, no, that's not what I meant. You thought it meant this, but actually it meant something else. So the words virav ya'avod sa'ir could be translated as virav, and the older ya'avod sa'ir, the younger shall serve. What I'm suggesting is that what was said to Rivka was in some sense ambiguous, and it was up to her to determine the meaning of that oracle. And she decided that it would mean that the older Esau would serve the younger Jacob. And of course, this is what she does. Now let's come to Rachel. Now here we're not in Genesis, but in Jeremiah, where Rachel embodies the cries of the people of Israel and maybe the land of Israel, that its people have been exiled. And God responds to this. Let me just see, yeah. Okay, move this. Yeah. Ko Amar Hashem, Kol B'Rama Nishma. So much pathos here. Thus said the Lord, a cry is heard in Ramah, wailing, bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children who are gone. But thus saith the Lord. Restrain your voice from weeping, your eyes from shedding tears, for there is a reward for your labor, declares the Lord. Exactly what that labor is not specified. They shall return from the enemy's land, and there is hope for your future, declares the Lord. Your children shall return to their land. So here we have, admittedly in a metaphorical sense, Rachel praying in the form of weeping, and God hearing and seeing those tears and responding to them and promising Rachel that her children will return to the land. And therefore, the word that we use to describe this instance is Menachem Rachel. God comforts Rachel, right? We are told she refuses to be comforted, but God, in fact, does comfort her. God is a Menachem. And finally, we come to the last one, which it's actually interesting to me. Many people of all of these are most uncomfortable with this one. So this is the story of how Leah was unloved, right? She was the second unloved wife of Jacob. And God saw that. The Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Leah conceived and bore a son, and named him Reuben, for she declared, now the Lord has seen my affliction. It also means, now my husband will love me, Yehavani. Actually, this hope, I think, is not realized. But let's go on and read what happens when she gives birth to Shimon. She conceived again and bore a son, and declared, this is because the Lord heard that I was unloved, and has given me this one also. And here is how we are reading these verses. Who, in fact, in all of Genesis, is the one who shows love to Leah? Our answer is God. God is the one who loves Leah. Ohev Leah, we say, because as an unloved wife, such a tragic situation, what God can offer Leah, and it is no substitute for a husband loving a wife, What he can do at the very least is offer her fertility, offer her the ability to provide children for a husband, so that at least in some degree, Jacob will take notice of her. But that's the pathos that we found here. The only place where we can find true love for Leah is in God, God granting her the blessings of children. Now, people have said to me, I feel very uncomfortable with that. And it seems to me that this is mainly because of our gendered way of thinking about God. If God were a woman and we were to say, Ohev Leah, loves Leah, I think that would be less of a problem. But here, when we speak of God, a male, as it were, loving Leah, people have a hard time filtering out a sexual connotation. And I think that that's unfortunate. I think that we should be able to talk about love between men and women, and God, if we are going to conceptualize God as a male, which is a whole other discussion, as having love that has nothing to do with sexuality. So I do reject, I'm not bothered by that particular critique. Now, is this the right formulation? No, I'll get to you in 1 second, Diane. It is a formulation, and we are all struggling to find a way to give the Imahot a voice in our prayers. Mine is a modest proposal. So I think it's not bad, but I'm not selling it. I'm offering it to you to inspire you to think about these questions, and who knows, maybe to compose your own Imahot. So I will stop there, but we will take Diane's question.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. I know we don't have much time, so an interesting response. So do you have any suggestions to those of us in a conservative synagogue whose rabbi will not consider any options except the avot of how to address it?
That's a
I mean,
tough one. That's a
I mean,
tough
we've had
several
some teaching
reasons.
sections.
I don't like
brought it
to,
up.
I
you
don't
know.
like to do an end run around
Okay, I'm just, looking for.
another rabbi. The best I can say is I have made a case this evening for including the Mahou. One possibility is to say to someone, happens to be one's rabbi, so be it, I heard an interesting presentation and I'd like to share it with you. So that way, without, attacking, it is simply a way of saying, I would like you to hear this. I would like to expand your horizon. I understand that you may still decide not to include the Imahot, but it would be sad, and that's a lot of what this evening is about. It would be sad if we didn't even consider including the Imahot because we were just convinced that it was a done deal. Tonight is about, at the very least, saying, let us rethink this question. Let us consider sources that we may not have considered before. And let's think about all of the halachic and other arguments aside, about how important it is to make the voices of all of Israel present in our prayers. At the end of the day, that is my guiding light here. Some people will share that and some people won't. But that is what has guided me in this discussion. What is important is I didn't just say, well, I think the Mahou should be included, so there we go, including the Mahou. I thought about it. I wrestled with the sources because I take them seriously, but I also was inspired by those sources. And I was able to come up with we were able to come up with an Mahou that I think is rather sophisticated and authentic, if I may say so. And that was our goal.
Okay. Maybe I'll have them call you because I'm not sure I will be articulate enough to make the argument. I'm just saying. I don't like being the second opinion. I've had that sometimes when I'm scholar in residence. Okay.
People ask me a question, which they ask the rabbi, and you get the answer they wanted. And I always say, this is a great question for your rabbi. So all I'm suggesting is, this is information that you might want to share.
Okay.
Maybe you would make them think differently.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Diamond.
Sure.
We so appreciate this amazing session.
I hope that everyone enjoyed their study sessions. We have a 10-minute break now, and our closing panel will begin at